Hi everyone, welcome back to the virtual field day. Today we're going to be focused on some of our grain trials. We wanted to focus on the grain trials first because, as you can see, although you can't really see because you're looking at me, we've already started harvesting. It's been a relatively early grain harvest because of the dry weather. So it almost feels a little bit more like Kansas than Vermont. And with all the dry weather, the grain has been able to mature and dry down relatively quickly. So we've already harvested all of our winter grains, winter barley and winter wheat. But as you can see, the winter rye is still out here. And winter rye matures a little bit later. So winter barley matures first, then winter wheat. And next is winter rye, and it's getting pretty close. We're probably still about a week away from harvest. And some people always say, well, how do you know when it's ready? And just one way is to thresh a little bit in your hand and then bite on it. Oh, you probably can't hear that way over there, but because we're more than 6 feet away. But if you hear that crunch, it's really hard, not at all chewy, then it's ready to harvest. Of course, having a moisture meter is the best way to tell what the moisture is and if you're ready to harvest, and also what the weather conditions are. We'll probably start harvesting if it stays dry, maybe at the end of this week. So, we've been doing more work on winter rye lately. There seems to be a resurgence in interest for this grain beyond cover crops. So most farmers grow winter rye and they grow it to cover bare ground in the winter. So it's very popular for that use in the Northeast, but it's also becoming increasingly popular for making breads, baked goods, brewing beer, and of course other spirits that we imbibe. So we've been asked by bakers and farmers and also distillers, what's the best variety to grow to malt for beer, or to make distilled spirits from, or to bake bread with? And we didn't really have the answer to that question, so that's one of the questions that we're trying to solve or answer up here at Borderview Farm. So in the background here, there are a number of different varieties that we're evaluating for all of those properties, and you'll hear my colleague Blair talk a little bit more about that later. But there's 12 different varieties that are out here of winter rye, and we're evaluating them for yield and quality, standability. You can see some of them are quite tall. I mean, I'm pretty short, and these are, you know, as tall as I am. And then there's others that are a bit shorter. So some of them might be more prone to lodging, and you can see these a little bit in the background sort of swaying back and forth. Okay, so we're really trying to figure out what are those best varieties that are going to perform well here in Vermont and then can be sold for whatever end use you're looking to meet. So this year it's been a really good grain year. We had a mild winter. Everything overwintered well. It's been fairly dry but wet enough that the grain has developed nicely, and now it's dry enough that the quality will stay really good. But last year was a completely different story. And actually in all of my years working at Borderview Farm, working with rye, I had never really seen much winter kill in rye. It's pretty hardy. But last year we saw some varieties with only 20% survival. So these are some of the parameters that we're looking at. If there's a variety in certain years that can't withstand a really cold winter, then maybe we don't want to grow it, because sometimes we do get a really cold winter. One of the things I would like to point out is that some of the varieties, like Wheeler in particular, had a really high crude protein of 15.1%. where many of the other varieties were down around 8 and 9%. We don't really know for bakers what protein level they do need. And is 15% too high? Or is 8% too low? So these are some of the questions that we're answering with our research. And we'll be harvesting this winter rye pretty soon, hopefully again this week or next, and we'll make sure we get the results from this year's variety trial posted on our website.
Hey folks, I'm Henry and I'm out here to talk to you about cereal rye and our harvest date trial. So one of the trials that we're doing is a harvest date where we plant two varieties, Hazlitt here and Danko, and we harvest them 1 week apart over the course of 4 weeks at the end of the summer. So the first harvest date was this week, and then we're going to do another one a week from now, 2 weeks from now, and 3 weeks from now. And we're really looking at the falling number. We understand that pretty well with wheat and barley, and we're trying to get a better understanding of what that means in rye, if the falling number test can be used in rye, and what it's telling us and what it's telling the bakers, and how they can work with it. So with this we can see the differences in falling number, the amount of seconds over here across the harvest dates for each of the two varieties, Hazlitt down here and Danko here. So we'll learn more about what the falling number seconds mean when we get to the lab. But out here it's just really important to see that, one, there is definitely a difference in falling number from harvest date 1. It actually went up a little bit to harvest date 2, and then they dropped down with harvest date 3 and 4. So the longer it's left out in the field, the more that falling number is going to drop. And also really interesting to see the difference in the two varieties. We see that Danko was relatively more stable over time. The falling number didn't drop quite as precipitously over the 3rd and the 4th week, whereas Hazlitt, it dropped off pretty sharply, and there's a pretty strong difference between the earlier harvest dates and the later. So not only are we understanding the effect of falling number in the bakery, but also what variety selection can tell us, and can help inform some of these production decisions. So last year, after we had all of the different rye samples from the various harvest dates and the two different varieties sorted out and tested in the lab, we wanted to do a blind baking test to understand how they performed in the bakery. So we worked with Jeffrey Hamelman and Randy George, who are both members and board members of the Northern Grain Growers Association, which we work with very closely. And they brought the grain into their bakeries, milled it, and did a baking test and evaluation using a standardized formula and evaluation form that they developed. So the breads were both baked the same and then judged on this 200-point scale to evaluate the fermentation time, the dough quality, how soft and wet and loose it may be versus how dry and dense and tight the dough might be. And we looked at the bread quality. So we're looking at loaf volume, crust color, crumb density and airspace in the interior of the bread, the texture of the crumb, whether it's dry and crumbly or wet and gummy and sticky, and then flavor, of course. So what we found was pretty interesting, that there were definite differences in the dough quality among the breads, and some fermented more quickly, some a little bit more slowly, some were drier, some were wetter, and there are differences both in loaf volume and crumb quality and crust color. So there is definitely an effect of the harvest date on the different samples and the quality of bread that we got out of it. And comparing to the harvest data, the falling number, the moisture of the grain and the harvest date, we're still not entirely clear on what those results mean. Some things that we did learn and were definite takeaways from the baking test and comparing to the various falling numbers, is that there seems to be a wide range of acceptable falling numbers in cereal rye for the baking, that there are some things that the baker can do to remedy either a higher or lower falling number to still create a good quality bread. So that's pretty important to know for farmers who are working directly with bakeries and trying to understand the quality of their crop and what's an acceptable falling number and range. A really important distinction between rye bread and wheat bread is what is happening during the fermentation process. So, and how the bread structure is created. In wheat, we rely really heavily on gluten and protein development, which creates that structure and those large air pores in the bread and that chewy, elastic texture that we all really love. And to develop that and create that structure, we need a long fermentation time and gentle handling for those proteins to break down and reorganize and strengthen. With rye bread, it's very different. It does have gluten, but it relies more on starches that are in the grain that ferment very rapidly. And so if the fermentation goes on for too long of a time period, those starches can begin to break down, and that's what creates that more gummy texture, which is less desirable. So the falling number value can tell the baker how quickly or slowly the bread might ferment, and if there's an additional step that they might need to take to adjust that time period to make sure that it's not over fermenting or under fermenting. So it's useful information, and we're trying to better understand how it can be really used by a baker and by a farmer. So here we are taking a closer look at the rye harvest date trial. We can see right here that the first harvest date was already harvested off the field this week, and that right over here is the Hazlitt. That's harvest date 2, so that's going to be pulled off next week. And this is Danko harvest date 3. So this will be pulled in 2 weeks from now, and then harvest date 4 is down that way. And so to wrap things up, I guess it's safe to say that we can grow rye here in Vermont. We can grow pretty good quality rye here in Vermont. And though we see that there's a wide range of potential varieties that can be grown by farmers and used by end users, and bakers can find and work with a range of different falling numbers in their rye, it's really important to note that if you're growing rye for brewing or distilling, if it's going to be malted, it's still really important that that rye has a high germination rate. It means a high falling number. Lower falling number rye means that the grain already began to sprout, and so it cannot be sprouted in the controlled environment of a malt house. So if you're looking for beverage end uses, having that, that falling number is a little bit more important to pay attention to. But it does seem like a viable option that if your falling number doesn't meet the requirements of the malt house, you might find a baker that is willing and able to work with it. So it offers a bit of a backup plan for you. Thanks for coming out to the rye harvest date trial, and I hope you found some information about falling number and harvest dates that can be useful.